Well, hello everybody. I'm very pleased that you're with us. I will deal with introductions because as some of you are brand new to the Transparency Task Force. I'm Andy Agathangelo. I lead the Transparency Task Force. We are an international community of people dedicated to actively transforming the way the financial system works. Our mission is to promote ongoing reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. And our vision is to build a highly respected, and for me personally, those two words are very, very important, a highly respected international institution that is dedicated to driving up the care for consumers from the financial services industry. So that's what we're all about. You may well be saying to yourself, well, what on earth has that got to do with data standards? So allow me to explain. Roughly 7 years ago, I got very involved with the pensions automatic enrolment marketplace in the UK. Some of you are outside the UK, so I'll explain. Pensions automatic enrolment is about the idea of compulsory pension scheme contributions from employers and from employees. And this was a massive new policy initiative. And it required, for the policy initiative to work, it required a huge amount of data to be transferred from the payroll industry to the pensions and investment industry. And the problem was that every single payroll company had its own data format, and every single pensions and investment company had its own its own data format, which very simply meant that there was a real risk of catastrophe moving all this data around. I got involved. I was asked to get involved by the pensions regulator in the UK, and myself and a number of other people worked collaboratively over a period of time to create something which became called PAPDIS, PAPDIS, the Pensions and Payroll Data Interface Standard. And PAPDIS succeeded in doing exactly what it was designed to do, to act as an intermediary, shall we say, a data hub that would enable the data transfer to take place that was necessary. That was my first ever real exposure to the topic of data standards. And I learned two very, very important lessons through this process. First of all, I learned that it is technically difficult to create, implement and operate data standards in the financial services sector. It is a difficult thing to do technically. However, the even bigger lesson that I found myself exposed to is the challenge of creating sufficient collaboration for people to actually want to work together and to want to create data standards. To be very blunt with you and very honest with you, when I first got involved with the group who were charged with the responsibility of creating this data standard, it really wasn't going anywhere. And we had 38 different stakeholder groups all arguing the case for why the data standard that should be implemented ought to be the data standard. People were thinking about themselves and their organizations and their agenda. They weren't thinking about the bigger picture. It does not in any way surprise me, ladies and gentlemen, that the financial services sector is not very advanced when it comes to harnessing the inherent benefits and advantages of data standards. The net result is we have a marketplace that is riddled with and frankly held back by all kinds of unnecessary frictions in the system because there isn't enough cooperation and collaboration on data standards. And this is bad news for everybody. So the topic we're talking about this evening, the data standards work from the Bank of England, I think is just symptomatic of a bigger issue, the need for the financial services sector to fully embrace data standards and frankly move forward quickly. So that, I hope, sets the scene. In June of 2019, I had the pleasure of running an event in Zurich. And at the event in Zurich, one of the speakers at my event was Willy Brammertz, who is with us this evening. Willy Brammertz presented Actus, which is an algorithmic based data standards initiative. Please just go to, or maybe Alan or Willy will pop the link to Actus into the chat. You're welcome to do that, gentlemen, if you'd like to. And when I saw Willy's presentation, it was like a eureka moment. I could see huge value, huge opportunity off the back of the wisdom that was inherent in the design of Actus, and I got very excited by it. And I'm very pleased that I did, because it effectively explains why we're here today. Off the back of Actus, the Actus presentation, I contacted Andrew Bailey, who at the time was the chief executive of the FCA, and basically said to him, Andrew, I encourage you to get your people at the FCA to take a look at Actus. And I also emailed Andy Haldane, who at the time I think was the chief economist at the Bank of England. Same narrative. I urge you to have your people at the Bank of England take a look at this. One thing led to another, and I've got two very fond memories. One, a massive meeting at the Bank of England, and I do mean massive. Willy flew over from Switzerland. Alan flew over from Washington, DC, Alan Mendelowitz, who's also here with us this evening. I think we met 11 senior data science people at the Bank of England, including the head of financial stability. There was, real interest. That meeting was a huge success in terms of sharing ideas. The equivalent meeting we had at the Bank of England was also a huge success. Willy flew over again from Switzerland. Alan flew over again from Washington, DC. The colleague Jeff flew over from the West Coast, USA. Another very, very good meeting. And since then, there's been ongoing discussion and debate with the Bank of England and with the FCA around this theme of what can we do to have more and better data standards in the financial services sector. And I think I'm right in saying this is the third symposium we've run around this particular topic, and we'll keep meeting every few months as and when there's reason to take the narrative forward. Because what I'm trying to do, and what seems to be working quite well so far, what I'm trying to do is to build an international community of people who understand the technical challenges in introducing data standards, but who also understand the human challenges, the collaboration challenges in introducing data standards. And I would be a very pleased and proud man if in years to come, we ended up with better harnessing of the power of data standards as a consequence, directly or indirectly, through the, frankly, huge amount of effort we are putting into this space. So I believe this is collectively an opportunity to create a public good, a mindset that is going to promote and encourage the better use of data standards in the financial sector around the world. I am very, very mindful that there are many tremendous subject matter experts on the session we have today, as in the previous two events that we have. And I personally am not in any way wedded to any particular solution, any particular model. All I want is the best of whatever's out there to happen. And that can only happen if we have the kind of conversation and candid debate that we are going to be having this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Alexandra in a moment just to deal with a few housekeeping points. But the primary goal tonight is to understand fully what the Bank of England is doing in the data transformation space and what that's going to mean and what we can do to help the Bank of England on its journey towards where it's trying to go, but also to openly discuss and debate what else can be done in relation to these issues. So everybody has an opinion. Everybody's opinion matters. If I did my job tonight, then everybody will have a chance to share what those thoughts are. We do have a great lineup of speakers. I hope you do find this very, very enjoyable. I also encourage everybody, please, to make full use of the chat. There are too many people on the call to take time to invite everybody to introduce themselves verbally, but don't hesitate to pop a few words about yourself, who you are, where you are, what you do, your contact details if you wish, into the chat. If you come away with half a dozen brand new contacts from this evening's session, then I'll be very, very pleased. I say this evening, it's evening in the UK. Some of you, of course, are not in the UK. Okay, Alexandra, my colleague, our head of events. Alexandra has so far this year led and run, I think I'm right in saying, Alexandra, 23 events. And we've had over 900 people through the Transparency Task Force doors this year. And it's not even the end of March. Well, it's kind of the end of March. But you can understand what a great job Alexandra does. Alexandra, please do share with us the housekeeping points that you would like to refer to now. And then we'll be going to our first speaker, Angus from the Bank of England. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you, Andy. So just to let you know, we are recording this event and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, hopefully in the next couple of days. I'll send an email around when it is available to watch. Also, Andy mentioned to put your details in the chat. I'll be circulating the chat notes tomorrow in a follow-up email, so do feel free to put any comments and your contact details or whatever you want to put in the chat. Also, if you want to, it'd be great if you could help us tweeting during the event. I'll put our Twitter handle and some hashtags you can use in the chat as well. Okay, enjoy.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Wonderful. Okay, I can see that we've already got our first contributor to the chat. That's really, really good. And I can also see we've also got the Actus Financial Research Founder link in there as well. All right, I think we've set the scene nicely enough. I hope that's okay with everybody. It's now my pleasure to invite Angus from the Bank of England to introduce himself and talk about the work that the Bank of England is doing. And Angus, over to you. Thank you very much for being here. We're all looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Angus. As Andy very kindly said and introduced me, I am the Senior Manager of the bank's Data Collection Transformation team. So I am responsible for the bank's work looking at transforming data collection. It has also been a bit of a journey and a road for me, this sort of data collection transformation work. I've been involved in data collection for about 5 years now, both involved in the bank's digital regulatory reporting work, which some people may have heard of, and also previously on a big project to collect data from the Bank of England's CCPs and clearinghouses that it regulates. A bit like Andy, I got into this topic in a bit of a strange route. So I used to be a risk analyst, and I spent so much time getting frustrated with arguing about models when I thought that the data was the problem. I thought, well, actually, I might as well go and try and figure out how to fix the data first, and then hopefully we'll sort out the models and the analysis later. So I'm here to talk to you about what I think and what I hope is quite an exciting project, and one which is very relevant to Andy and your mission to try to improve transparency in the financial sector, as you said, to roll out data standards as part of that process. For those of you who don't know, to give you a bit of background, so the Bank of England has been, as I said, thinking about transforming data collection for a good few years now. It started to a certain extent from a strategic perspective. I mean, and I have to say that the bank has done lots of work on improving data collection on an incremental perspective and an incremental basis throughout the last few years. But in terms of us taking a long-run strategic approach, that really started with our involvement in the Digital Regulatory Reporting Project, which was a pilot that we co-hosted with the FCA and involved 7 financial firms. That really started to think about what is the long-term future of data collection. And I think that in particular, why now? Why is the bank and the FCA and other regulators actually around the world thinking about kind of the long-term future of data collection and how to do this really well? I think that's a couple of things. First of all, a recognition that over the last, I guess, sort of 10, 15 years or so, particularly post-financial crisis, there has been a big increase in the amount of data that we collect from institutions. And perhaps both ourselves and industry haven't always responded to that increase in the demand for data collection in a way which is strategic. And perhaps we've taken at times slightly sort of shorter term perspectives or shorter term designs, shorter term solutions to fixing what perhaps over time is really requires some sort of longer term fixes. And the second thing I think is that, you know, as an organization, and you know, given the world we live in, we recognize that our expectations really about data are increasing over time. We want to be more data-driven in our decision making, and so, you know, and you know, particularly in new areas like climate change as well, that we don't think that our requirements for data are all of a sudden going to stop, and so, you know, there is still this need to put data collection on a better footing, on a more strategic footing. And so that work started, like I said, with the regulatory reporting, digital regulatory reporting work, which was innovation, it was research, it was quite forward-looking. It was with a relatively small number of participants. And then last year, we built on that when we carried out our data collection review, which was the top of the institution, really the governors and the deputy governors signaling that actually, you know, we really want to, as an institution, look at data collection and try to figure out what is the long-term solution. That review was completed at the end of last year, and the main output of that review was what we're calling our transformation plan for data collection. That was published at the end of February, and that's the main thing that I'm going to talk about today. And as I said, this is all about strategy. It's about long-term vision for data collection, and so this is going to be a long-term piece of work rolling out this plan. And we don't think it's going to be finished by 2031 at the earliest. I mean, quite easily it could be a sort of 15-20 year project. So what did we find out in our review? And perhaps if we start off with the problems and the issues, I think really understanding your problems is often almost 95%, maybe not 95% of the way, but a good step in the right direction before we get into solutions and actually fixing your ultimate issues. And when we thought, and we spoke to firms, and we spoke to, I think, about over 260 different organizations during this process, and we spoke to them about their issues and the problems they faced. I think the thing that really underpinned a lot of the problems they faced was really a really incredibly complex landscape that has developed over time, both on the firm side and on industry side, in terms of the way that they manage their data and the way that ultimately they source their data, which they supply to us. And also on our side, in the way that we go about collecting data and the reports that we define to collect data. And I think both of that complexity, both in terms of the reports and the instructions and also on the firm side, are really, as I said, to a certain extent, a result of a legacy of decision making that's happened, you know, throughout not just the last 10 years to a certain extent, but actually probably before that, where we've always taken perhaps sort of short-term decisions in responding to change, and never truly integrated some of our legacy systems, our legacy reports, our legacy ways of working into the current sets of reports. And I guess, as I said, that's really what this project is all about. It's about trying to take that longer term perspective. It's trying to take, really ask ourselves, how do we build a sustainable, efficient, and flexible data collection process that's going to really, hopefully, be robust to changes in data collection, not just over the next 5 years, but the next sort of 30, 40, 50 years. If those were the problems we need to tackle, what are the big long-term reforms that we think we need to develop here and we need to implement here? The first one is absolutely, as Andy was talking about earlier, we think that the heart of this kind of solution is going to be the development and the adoption of common data standards. And we think these data standards are really about identifying and describing in quite a fundamental way the way that data is identified and held within and described within systems and within firms. And to give you an example of what we mean by this, let's take a mortgage amount or a loan amount for a mortgage. We ideally want to be able to identify the loan amount of a mortgage across every single firm, across every single sector within every single organization that reports to us within the financial sector. So it makes the question of, can you give us the loan amount of your mortgages within the financial sector, potentially a relatively easy and simple exercise. The second big topic area we call modernising reporting instructions. Some of you may have seen or may have read that we published a discussion paper last year, and that was really what kicked off the review. And in that discussion paper, we talked a lot about kind of the complexity of the reporting requirements that we publish, and a whole range of options that we think that might help improve the efficiency of the process of people understanding, interpreting, and then implementing our reporting instructions. And these solutions range in terms of their ambition and their complexity and the amount of technology that they require. So on perhaps the most ambitious sort of technology end, there's this idea that we developed actually as part of digital regulatory reporting of instructions as code. And this is always talking about how can we enhance automation and increase efficiency and accuracy as well of reporting instructions by starting to publish our reporting requirements, not just in perhaps natural language or PDF format, but in some kind of machine executable code or some sort of at least some machine readable version of our reporting instructions. But alongside that, we think there are other things which perhaps are less dependent on technology. Things like industry interpretation forms, as we call them, where we provide a safe space where industry can come together and agree one standard or perhaps a small set of standard interpretations to how to get from our reporting requirements to the data and the systems and the processes that exist within the organization. And the final reform we call integrated reporting. This is a high-level reform that actually has quite a few different dimensions that sit within it. All of those dimensions are really about trying to make, as the title suggests, the whole reporting process feel more integrated and more consistent. The first one I'd highlight is the idea of can we have a more integrated end-to-end reporting solution or reporting process. And so here we're thinking about when we write our reporting instructions, how can we make it much easier, much more effective, and perhaps take into greater account the way that those reporting instructions are ultimately going to be implemented by firms. And then once the data is being supplied to us, again, how can we take greater into account the way that we're going to collect that data, to store that data, and ultimately serve it up to the users of that data. The second thing is what you might call horizontal integration if you're an economist. And this has perhaps two aspects, one on our side, on the regulatory authority side. And this is all about, can we try to increase the consistency, let's say, between our regulatory collections and our statistical collections and our markets and banking collections, and between the way we do collecting data from all the different uses of data within our organization. That's going to include as well aspects of trying to work out how can we increase the consistency of our reports that we collect and the data that we collect, and where possible to duplicate data, and certainly make data more comparable and easier to understand how we can consolidate that data between different reports. The second aspect of horizontal integration, I think, is really on the firm side. And here we're thinking partly again about processes. So to what extent can we integrate reporting processes that are both external and internal, and between various different regulators and other central banking authorities, but also integrating data. So can we make it more consistent in the way that data is stored or managed between different business areas, for instance? So can we make residential mortgage data seem a bit more like commercial real estate data, because we think they should be quite similar, and also in the way they're managed and the data is stored. So if those are three key reforms, those are the long-term things that, in 10 years' time we want to have delivered and we want to have got to. The next question is, how do we think we're going to deliver those reforms? And the first thing to say as well, in an incremental fashion. This isn't going to be a big bang that on a particular date in the future we're going to roll everything out. It's going to be a multi-phase, use case by use case delivery approach, which is going to be much more incremental than that. We think that the first phase of incremental approach, our phase one, is really focused on two things. Firstly, trying to take that step forward and leap 10 years into the future and say, well, actually, what does the future data collection process look like? Let's remove some of the typical barriers and constraints that often not necessarily cloud our decision making, but certainly frame our decision making when we're looking at sort of the 1, 2, 3 year time horizon. The second thing is we want to take aspects of that future solution and deliver them in a probably relatively limited scope for a couple of use cases, but certainly start to show the value of the work that we're doing and make progress, even if it's small and incremental, towards that future state. Phase 2 then is going to be about taking hopefully more of what we deliver, more of our future solution, and delivering it for more use cases and delivering it in wider scope. And secondly, in particular, I think thinking about the integrated reporting approach reform, trying to think about how can we start to consolidate and increase the consistency of various different reports, and in particular legacy reports that we have. And then the third phase, this is talking sort of 5+ years in the future. Hopefully with the model proven, with the business case proven, then it's a question of actually just starting to roll out that solution and roll out the ways of working to as many use cases as possible. So at the heart of this sort of incremental delivery approach, we need some vehicles to deliver the reform. We need some people to do some work. We need some money to be spent, quite frankly. And one of the key vehicles we're setting up, we're calling our joint transformation program. And this is going to have 2 committees that are going to focus on slightly different aspects of our reporting transformation. So one on data standards and one on reporting transformation itself. It's going to be a joint transformation program done with the FCA and with industry. We think we need everyone who's involved in the data collection process to be in the room together when we're thinking about what is the long-term solution. And that includes also standard bodies. It includes service providers. It includes everyone else who has opinions or who has a stake in this process. Those committees are going to be supported by delivery teams who are going to be working on the ground, who are going to be understanding both what the problems are and the issues are, and also starting to design solutions and starting to really map out in some kind of tangible sense what that long-term solution looks like. It's really important to say that, but A, for sort of scope reasons, and B, I guess from a pragmatic perspective, that our joint transformation program is not going to be the only thing that delivers our reforms. And so from a bank perspective, we're going to need to be thinking about doing changes upstream, perhaps as part of our internal processes, and also as part of other aspects of rethinking perhaps what data we collect. And there's ongoing work already in that area in terms of the Solvency II review, which is looking at what aspects of Solvency II reporting we need in the future. But also there's going to be work that's ongoing within the private sector, both within the UK and also internationally. And actually potentially also other authority regimes and other authority initiatives. And we want to support those too as well. We're not saying that this is work that we have to do by ourselves or it has to be a UK solution. What is important for us is that we have reforms that are delivered, that they work, that they meet our objectives, and they really help our data collection processes move forward. And so, as I said, we want to work with those initiatives. We want to support those initiatives too. And we want to be open and collaborative as possible to make sure that this does feel like a solution that works, not just from the UK, but internationally too. And finally, to really help that kind of coordination and alignment, and to try to make this feel like it's going to be resourced on a long-term basis, because we know this isn't going to be a short-term change, we want to set up this reporting and data standards transformation board. We think this is going to be relatively irregularly, but hopefully when it does meet, the statements it makes will be powerful. We kind of see this as a bit like sort of the G7 summits for data collection and for reporting and for data standards. So it'll be very, very senior people within the industry, we hope. And they'll come together, and as I said, they will help align and coordinate and hopefully push resources for this, what we think is a really important work. Dive down a little bit deeper, as I said, so kind of the next 2 years is going to be the first focus for us. Within our joint transformation program in particular, the first year or so is going to be about designing the future, within the next year looking to deliver change and deliver value. And when we're thinking about where we're going to deliver value, we have 3 key use cases we want to look at. The first one is called quarterly statistical derivatives returns. This is an ongoing Bank of England statistical return that collects aggregate data on the derivatives market. That data is then used to A, publish on a website, and B, feeds through to the national accounts, and therefore an estimate of the value of the financial sector to the UK economy. We think there's opportunities here to improve A, how that return is implemented, and B, potentially also the way that we publish our reporting instructions, and to align actually with a number of different both internal bank and also external initiatives looking at improving derivatives data. Secondly is the commercial real estate lending database. This is an industry, another industry project which they're setting up, which is looking to create a utility, a database that serves the whole market, that will provide a centralized source of data on the commercial real estate market. We hope longer term that this database will also be used for reporting to us. And the focus of this use case and the delivering this use case, we think, will be looking to implement data standards, hopefully for commercial real estate lending, that will support the implementation of that database. And thirdly, a slightly different use case that is not, I guess, a really strong data collection use case, but we think is quite exciting nonetheless, is what we're calling our upgrading liquidity monitoring metric tool use case. The liquidity monitoring metric tool, which before up till a couple of weeks ago was the kind of thing that no one really had heard or known about, which is all of a sudden has become famous actually within our transformation work. It's an Excel spreadsheet that we publish on our website that tells firms how to calculate a set of liquidity metrics that we calculate internally and we use to assess their liquidity risk. And the idea about publishing it is that it helps firms also understand the way that we're looking at their business. So when we come together in a supervisory meeting, for example, we have a common understanding of what the liquidity risk that we see that they face are. The part of the goal of this use case is absolutely to improve this tool. This is a tool in Excel, but it changes quite a lot and it's quite complex. So maintaining it for us as an institution, and I'm sure as well for firms as well, is quite a complex business. But longer term, and I guess this is quite the exciting bit, is it's about the nearest thing we have in the bank or the PRA to publishing sort of introductions as code or machine executable regulation. And so we think if we can get this right, there's really a broad set of applications that we can potentially use this kind of new capability for, including data collection, and actually it can kind of provide a model that we can, in the future, for instance, publish, I don't know, our capital requirements regulations in code or liquidity requirement regulations in code as well. This is a really exciting and interesting potential use case for us to target and to deliver here. I will finalize before I go and to say, or before I move on for any questions, just to say that, as I said, in particular, this joint transformation program is a program about all of us getting together if you're involved in the data collection of the reporting process. And if you do want to be involved, please do let us know. There's lots of space for people to be involved. We are really actively looking for resource, ranging from committee members to people who are coming in who are users of data collection and reporting processes at the moment, all the way through to people working full-time with us on the ground trying to map out design solutions. So do get involved. This is hopefully not just about benefiting data collection. As Ali says, data standards, a lot of these things hopefully can benefit the industry more generally. And we think hopefully this is a great platform for us to start realizing those benefits. And with that, I'll pause for any questions.
Angus, thank you very much indeed for running through those slides and delivering such a clear message. And I really am delighted to hear the openness with which you are encouraging people to make contact and get involved. I really do think this is absolutely the right approach. Clearly, the more stakeholders you have involved, the more people you have feeding in thoughts and ideas, the better the end result is going to be. So I'm just really pleased that the Bank of England and the FCA are not sort of operating in a closed room somewhere. You're making this a very inclusive and indeed a very expansive exercise, and I'm very pleased and frankly a bit proud that the little old TDF is playing a part in bringing people together for this purpose. Angus, if I may, I'm going to put a couple of questions to you first of all myself, and then we'll open up to the rest of the members here. Do you have a vision around design issues like whether you're going to be pulling data or pushing data, whether you're going to be able to kind of technologically link into sources of data so organizations don't have to keep pushing it to you, you can actually sort of pull it from the sources? Is that a matter that's been discussed in any way, and whether it has or hasn't, do you have any views on that? If you don't mind sharing your thoughts on that. And of course, we're not going to commit you to the end result here, just it'd be good to get your thoughts on that one. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So particularly this issue of sort of pushing versus pulling data was something we discussed quite a lot as part of the data collection review. And actually, when we wrote our discussion paper, we had a whole topic on what we called kind of architecture and governance changes that included some of these aspects of pushing versus pulling data, and also perhaps creating a central utility. The feedback that we got on those solutions was, well, I guess it was mixed. I mean, some people certainly saw that as part of the longer term solution. But in general, people felt that they were that the other solutions, common data standards, modernizing reporting instructions, were perhaps kind of a bit more foundational and also more broadly applicable. So whereas you could see pulling data happening for certain specific use cases, that you could see common data standards and modernizing reporting instructions being useful across all use cases. And the second thing is that I think people kind of saw on the cost versus benefit equation, they didn't necessarily see a huge deal, kind of great increase in benefits of moving from a pull to a push, or a push to a pull, sorry. And that was also, I think, you know, again, was partly a reflection of the way people think this actually might happen in practice. If we went from a push to a pull model, we still would need to have some kind of push first, where data would have to be verified and checked before it could be shipped out of the building to the Bank of England. And so again, perhaps the kind of as like I said, the benefits versus cost equation doesn't favour as greatly as it did for common data standards and modernising reporting instructions.
Thank you,
Angus. So the short answer,
I was thanking you for the answer. That's very clear. I'm sure others will have some views on this that they may want to share a little bit later on. Thank you. And completely different subject. Alistair Milne and Alistair's with us tonight, have talked about the idea of creating what amounts to a mind map that shows all the activity going on around the world in relation to the topic of better use of data standards in the financial services sector. I'm certainly still up for doing that. I think and hope Alistair might be, if we can get sufficient backing for it. Do you, Angus, see any merit in having if you like, a meta study, a mind map of the activity going on in this space around the world, on the basis that surely we don't want to go reinventing the wheel unnecessarily, surely we want to avoid any duplication, and also surely we also want to know where the real gaps are in the thought leadership around the world that need to be filled. Any general comments on that? And again, don't feel awkward. I'm not going to hold you to anything at all.
No, I think it is. I think it is important, and I think it would be a very useful and valuable artifact for our work and for the financial sector more generally.
Right.
And as I said in that slide, with the sort of the different initiatives and the joint program, it's not just us who can deliver this, and we absolutely don't want to invent the wheel. For us, it's about the reforms. It's about the outcomes that are important.
Yeah,
not necessarily the way that we get there.
Thank you very much indeed. Angus, great stuff. I'm now going to invite Rich Robinson to introduce himself and put his point or question to you, and then we'll go to Gavin Palmer. If anybody else wants to ask a question, of course, you're very welcome to. Please do just raise your hands either digitally, as these gents have done, or literally if you don't know how to do that. Mr. Rich Robinson, please do tell us who you are, where you are, why you're interested in all this, and then, of course, move on to your point. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. And so Rich Robinson, based in the States. I work for Bloomberg LP. However, my comments here are mine, just to be clear on that. I have 30 years in the industry, 25 years in standards and industry, chairing groups for ISO, ZITSI, and second vice chair for the ZITSI organization in North America. And I've been doing a lot of work, and Andy's going to smile when I say applied linguistics for the past couple of years. I do have a forthcoming book coming out on it, but I really appreciate what the Bank of England's doing, especially very forward-looking and very thoughtful. The only concern I have on anything that you stated was common standards, and my concern is there's been a sort of focus on common standards and looking at a common financial language, where from a linguistics perspective, you can't, that's sort of not possible, right? Because language constantly evolves, constantly diverges. And if you look at financial services as overall, there's many different communities that each have their own distinct languages. The example you gave about having very specific standards in mortgages, that makes sense, right? Because that mortgage community would share a language, but trying to use whatever standards you use in the mortgage community for derivatives would not make sense, right? So I think there needs to just be an inclusion of the understanding that there are many different communities with different languages, that we're not going to make everybody in the financial industry adopt Esperanto, right? Brokers speak differently than investment managers. Front office speaks different than back office. Equity speaks different than fixed income. And recognizing those language differences and creating standards within the communities, and then focusing on how to translate between those languages would probably be a good foundation for the Bank of England to pay attention to. So I just wonder if you have an opinion on that.
So first of all, I think we were quite careful when we chose the word. So if you read our paper, we didn't say common financial language
Yes.
or single data dictionary anywhere in the paper. We say common data standards for quite a specific reason, which is common for us means across industry. It implies openness. It implies this is something which we can all use. And data standards means it should be a standard for data, not necessarily a standard for language. We absolutely recognize that. A great example that I think about quite a lot is accounting. Is the language of accounting tries to be standardized by a number of different accounting frameworks that exist around the world, but is only standardized up to a certain point. So we have US GAAP, we have IFRS, etc. So we, as a group, we could turn around and we could say, well, we should try and standardize the definition of net profit or income or etc. That particular data point. But there's already many people who are already trying to standardize that term. And so to me, the question is not necessarily how do we standardize the definition of net profit, it's how do we record that definition where it is standardized in a system in a consistent way so that we can identify that in a consistent way.
Yeah, no, I totally appreciate that. I would just say that data is an expression of language. So we just have to be concerned about that. And the use of words like standards and common, people start to assume that if we say this is a trade, that that definition of trade is going to apply across everyone. Meanwhile, investment manager's version of a trade may differ from the back office version of a trade. Yeah. So, but I totally appreciate that you understand the concern, and that's great to hear.
And I'll just close by saying, to a certain extent, my opinion doesn't necessarily matter. We are creating this joint transformation program so we can get together and we can have this debate collectively, and we can come up with solutions. So hopefully that
yeah, and I definitely want to applaud that approach. That's fantastic.
Great stuff. A very helpful exchange there. Can I just ask what might be a really stupid question, but I'm the kind of guy who feels comfortable asking stupid questions. So whilst, for example, Rich, whilst there would definitely be people having their own language depending upon, if you like, what part of the industry they're in, whether they're brokers or risk analysts or whatever they might be, does there come a point when the actual, forgive the phrase, the actual kind of technical data science experts, the data science experts all have a pretty common language, and it doesn't really apply whether they're talking about the science of data in the mortgage space or the science of data in the stockbroking space? Does there come a point where high enough up the kind of technical pyramid, it's all just science and data, and it doesn't really matter where the actual application of that data sits? Any comment to that, Rich? I just wondered what your thoughts would be about that.
Yeah, so that's where some of the trouble lays as well, right? So what you're talking about is the data science tools that can be used to express different languages. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it will make all those languages interoperable or the same, right? So I can use many different programming languages to accomplish the same thing, but there are certain languages, certain programming languages that are very good for certain things. Does that answer your question? So, I'm actually involved with a data science group within ISO TC68's SC1, and that's really the discussion, right? So how do we make sure that there's tools available? Do you use ontologies and taxonomies? Are we going to use SCOS versus OWL and RDF? Those are the tools that we can use to try and communicate some of these differences and relationships and whatnot, but that doesn't necessarily automatically make everything work together. And one approach is still not enough to sort of address this problem of these different languages within these different communities that exist. Even though we're all part of the same social system of financial services trying to accomplish the same thing, we become very specialized, like medical system, right? This is an example that I use that the Dean of Carnegie Mellon's linguistics gave me, is you have a bunch of oncologists, and a podiatrist walks in the room, he's not going to understand what they're talking about, right? Because they're using their own language, their own jargon to talk specifically about their issues. If you have a medical problem, if you have heart disease, you don't want your pediatrics person operating on you.
Mm.
You know, there's specialties within financial services, and they have their own distinct and unique languages, which we need to pay attention to. Modeling those ends up being needing those tools of data scientists that you mentioned, but which tools we use and how they work together is also a challenge in itself.
Rich, thank you very much. You've added to my knowledge and understanding here. That's great to hear. I wonder though, if it's possible. I'm thinking about, for example, the way Actus works. I wonder if it's possible to kind of turn all that complexity into a relatively simple narrative by boiling everything down to, for example, the cash flow profile of these issues. It's a really interesting conversation. Let's go to Gavin, then we'll go to Willie. Gavin,
It's just on Actus. I would say yes.
Yeah. Yep.
Actus can help organize some of the chaos, maybe not get rid of all the complexity, but for Actus is one of those tools. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Gavin, good to see you, Gavin. It's been a while, sir. Please do take that opportunity to introduce yourself and share with us your point. Thank you, Gavin.
Great. So I was also involved in a company which combined retail data. And one of the things was about the secrecy in terms of credit cards. And there was a real power about setting a deadline and setting various hoops before that happened, in terms of focusing senior management and IT and others to actually have to address the problem and deal with that. And it seems a little bit in terms of, although this is a very reasonable timeline, that there needs to be something that will focus minds when they're planning the new year's data. Anyway, aside from that part, UBS has called about their highly significant losses, and bond yields are at 300-year lows, or if not more. This Q4 of 2021 needs to be happening pretty rapidly, because typically a crisis happens in September or October. If you look historically with manias, panics and crashes, and the Great Crash and those various sort of schemes of books, mainly because people have come back over the summer, and then there's you know, any of the mystery of crops and things. But in terms of banking, what I noticed, we've got lots of little data here, and you know, the transmission of data to the bank. But with analyzing a company, and I have won a stock picking competition by several 100%, there is quantitative, i.e. the facts and figures, and there's also qualitative. Now, the qualitative side can give you an idea if there is concerns, even though there might be only a few whistleblowers or complaints, that actually there might be someone evenly-minded who is trying to cook the books and try to hide things, a bit like the Bank of Crooks and Commerce International. So is on the same line, are you, the Transparency Task Force have started up a thing of the complaints and fines that something like that also needs to be done in parallel for the qualitative side, where you would have flags, red, orange, yellow, in terms of if the executives or data people had been lying in a company and in a critical role. And also that you'd have ones for whistleblowers. And the easiest way I've seen of analyzing that sort of data quickly is something like company rest with half moons compared to the sector, compared to overall, so that the Bank of England could very quickly assess and analyze both the qualitative side and the quantitative side of the information.
Gavin, just before Angus comments on your question, I found that really interesting. Angus, I'll definitely fix up, if you don't mind, a bit of time to talk to you about what we're doing on the tracking of violations front, because I think Gavin makes a really good point. We mustn't also forget the non-numerical data that's out there, the qualitative stuff that could also actually help to understand what's going on within a particular organization. It might be that Hamish McAllister, who's with us tonight, has something you'd like to say about that later. I'll leave it to Hamish to comment on that. And similarly, it might well be that Alan Grody would like to talk about a point that came up just now as well. The point that Alan Grody makes so well is it's going to be mission critical importance for the great big chief executives of the great big organizations to seriously get behind this kind of data transformation space, because without massive buy-in within the great big corporates, the big global enterprises, without them having an appetite for transformation, we're always going to be banging our head against the wall of the objection, yes, but it's going to cost too much money to do it. We don't need to do it, so why are we bothering? Why don't we leave this to the next year? And then the can just gets kicked down the road further. I know that Alan Grody speaks very well about that point. Perhaps he'd like to come back to it later. Angus, I'll now pass over to yourself if you'd like to comment in relation to the points that Gavin made, and then we'll go to Willie. Thank you.
So firstly, on this sort of the mandate and urgency point, I think it is an important point, and I think it's something that actually we got quite a bit of feedback during the review process of people kind of saying, look, we think this is really valuable, but it needs you to take a strong role here. It needs you to force the issue at times and to create a timetable which will force change. And I think that's a message which is understood within the bank and the PRA, and I think there will be, I think it's as we said in the discussion paper, so in the transformation plan, it's we have a bunch of tools that we can use to try to accelerate timetables and to create that urgency, and I think we're absolutely open to considering using those tools. I think particularly early on and where we are in the process is and given that we want this to be a collaborative process, I don't think we're there yet. And any time we do use any of these tools, we have to go through consultation processes. There has to be due process we need to follow. We can't just make policy based on the whims of our requirements. That we've got to think about the overall costs and benefits. What I will say in particular as well, and I think it speaks to your point about getting CEOs involved. This is really the top of the organisation who are backing this. It's the governor, it's the deputy governors, it's the executive directors from the bank and from the PRA, and for instance, the governor, the deputy governor, and Gareth Ramsey, our CDO, who've been speaking to CEOs at both UK and international banks recently on this topic. So, and I think that they, as well as us, really recognise that the value that this could potentially deliver to the UK financial sector. And so I do think that conversation and that argument is being won. On the quantitative versus qualitative point, I think it's an interesting question. So first of all, I have to be clear that our remit, our scope is quantitative data. It's not qualitative data. And the second thing is to say that the qualitative data is something which the PRA in particular already looks at, and we've been investing quite heavily in new tools that use machine learning and AI to improve our ability to analyse qualitative data that we receive from firms.
Thank you very much indeed. Very clear responses indeed, Angus. This is going really well. I hope everyone's enjoying it and learning something from it. I certainly am. We'll now go to Willie. Frankly, if it wasn't for Willie, none of us would be here, because I wouldn't have bought into the importance of data standards a couple of years ago. So we have Willie to thank for us being here tonight. Willie, over to you, sir. Lovely to see you as always. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, my point is more towards Rich, because, and you corrected it already a little bit with your last comment. There is one language that is clear and without any doubt, and it was created for that, and that's mathematics. So there you have black and white. And the core of the financial system is an exchange of cash flow, as we know, and all the risks stem from that. There's a qualitative side, I'm sure, but I'm talking about the quantitative one here. So, and that exchange of cash flows, that follows algorithmic rules. And of course, a trader, a bond trader, they talk maybe of capital, where others talk of notional, and they mean the same thing. And it's clear that but if you have that mathematical background, where all the exchange is expressed as algorithms, then we have a mathematical relationship between the data, the input data, and the final cash flows, which are then under scrutiny for the risk analysis. So that's I wanted to add, actually. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, Willie. And Willie's speaking a little bit later on. Perhaps he'll take an opportunity later to develop some of those points. Yeah. I'm going to click to gallery view so I can hopefully see folk. Please do wave your hand at me if you'd like to make a point or ask a question. You're all welcome to do that if you'd like to. It looks like Dan Hockley. Dan, great to have you with us. We've seen a fair bit of each other in recent weeks. It's been great to have your involvement. It really has been. Dan, please take the opportunity, if you don't mind, talk about yourself and what you do, but also touch on the things you've done in the past, because you bring to this conversation a great deal of real life, frontline, making standards work experience. And I'd be grateful to you if you don't mind touching on some of the things you've been involved with in the past. And then please do move on to your point. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, so I've been working in the pensions industries for my sins for over 20 years now. I've been involved in many data standards and trying to get trustees to understand data and big data for over 20 years, and we were very successful at doing that, raising data standards throughout the pensions industry. I initially worked with the PPF and FAS, helping transfer all the data coming from a huge number of schemes into those systems. FAS is a very small kind of version of the pension protection fund. And then after that, we helped define the 2012 standards from data, which took a reasonable amount of time to achieve, but it was a very successful kind of piece of work. More recently, I was involved in the pensions dashboard, but when I sold our company, I had to spend a few years away from the pensions industry as I sold my company, and now that's over, I'm kind of back involved in many data initiatives. So I've had a lot of background, and my main speciality in all of that was kind of seeing both sides. I'm a programmer by heart, but I also worked for the government for a long time, so I understand actually delivering to the end people is sometimes different to what a technical person thinks is good. Doesn't necessarily mean an administrator will think that's exactly what they wanted in the first place, and trying to translate the data into something that's actually meaningful for the end user or the end purpose of that data set. My point really was, one of the things that I have learned, sadly, with trustees, with companies, with a variety of people involved in these things, was that there does need to be some form of incentive. It doesn't have to be a financial incentive or a competitive edge perhaps coming across. It can be a much softer benefit, whether that's however they want to do a PR exercise on it or whatever. But what we did found is people were very slow to take up on these things until they realized what the benefit was. Trustees didn't listen to data being a problem within our industry for a number of years, until we started doing buyouts for various companies and were saving these buyout companies hundreds of millions of pounds just by saying, well, the data's wrong, so you don't have to pay them all of those pensions. And that kind of led to kind of the data initiatives within the pensions industry. And I'm sure there'll be some other incentives that we can give to these companies and the CEOs to make sure that they do drive this forward. I don't know what that is. I must admit I am not a specialist in banking data at all, but I am a specialist in understanding how you can make sure you can get from A to B in the cheapest and quickest possible time.
Thank you very much indeed, Dan. And I forgot what FAS is, by the way. If you don't mind popping a note into the chat what FAS is, it'll be useful. Angus, has there been much discussion around what's actually going to get companies to do what needs to be done? Because there is going to be some inertia, there is going to be some resistance, there's going to be reluctance, perhaps even a fear, perhaps even some cost constraints. What's been the chat so far around this very important topic that Dan's raised around incentive?
Well, I think that the initial carrot, and we probably internally think this is quite a high estimate, but certainly one that was published in a report called the Future Finance Report that the bank commissioned, is that reporting just in the UK alone potentially could cost the industry between £2.5 and £4 billion. So that's quite a big pie that you're trying to take cost out of. And if you can make much damage on that, you can do much damage to that, then you're going to make quite a lot of progress quite quickly. So that's the initial incentive. And to a certain extent, what we're saying to industry is, like, if you believe that figure is correct, or even anywhere near that figure is correct, then this is your opportunity to come to work with us and to try and find a way that reduces that cost. And I think that, and the flip side to that is also saying that this is probably only going to get worse. It's not going to get better. Like I said at the start of the conversation, data is not becoming less important to regulators and to the industry. It's becoming more important. I think the other thing to say as well is that, particularly when you look at data standards and look at other aspects of this, it's just so fundamental to the way that organizations work. And I think that people, and when you look at some of the other initiatives out there, if you look at, for instance, it's the CDM initiatives, it's about taking out large chunks of costs within operation processes as well. So there are a number of different angles you can use to sell this, some of which is a lot of money, billions and billions of pounds that the industry is spending today, which you can potentially reduce quite significantly.
Thank you again. Very, very, very clear. And is there, I imagine, Angus, something of a driver in terms of how on earth do central banks around the world, regulators around the world, how do they have a hope in hell of getting to grips with what's going on in the financial ecosystem if there's so much data coming at them, whether it's pushed or pulled? How can they cope with this snowstorm, this blizzard of data being thrown around in an unformatted, unstandardized, Wild West kind of way in so many instances? Is part of the driver the idea that central banks and regulators must have an understanding of what's going on in the financial ecosystem at any point in time for macro risk understanding? Is that part of the narrative as well, Angus, to any degree?
I think so. As an organization, we're quite complex, and our needs are quite complex. They range from our collections, they range from the PRA, which wants typically, in general, high-level prudential regulatory data, but also at times for its kind of risk deep dives, it wants quite granular data. Our financial stability area, that again can want quite granular data, but also can want quite kind of aggregate prudential capital or financial accounting data as well. Then statistical, which has its own frameworks, its own set of requirements. Markets and banking, which again has its own set of requirements, its own types of data that it's looking for. So I start from the starting point that our data needs are complex, and we should expect the data we collect to be relatively complex as a result of that. And I would also talk about, and when I think about this, that complexity is also one which is not time consistent. So at any given point in time, we might want actually quite a small slither of data from the financial sector, and that can be quite a simple slither. But if you look at our needs over time, and the way I can describe this is we want some of the data all of the time, and perhaps all of the data some of the time. And it's that all the data some of the time question which is almost the most problematic. That's the coronavirus scenario. It's the financial crisis. It's the unexpected question that we can't answer, and where there can be a tendency, and I think there has been a tendency, that we try and collect all that data up front in large, huge transactional, perhaps data collections. but that's not a sustainable solution longer term. We can't just take all the financial sector's data and store it in huge warehouses in central places in the hope that at some point we need it. We've got to find something which is more sustainable, which really speaks to the operational, the way that firms are going about their business, where reporting becomes almost a side effect that becomes much easier to do, rather than every time we need some data, there's this huge cost and initiative and set of projects that go about taking that data and transforming it and submitting it to us. I don't think that's a long-term sustainable option.
Thank you very much indeed, Angus. This is really interesting stuff. We're going to go to Alan in Washington, DC, then we're going to go to Tanya, I think, in London. Alan, to you first. Thank you.
The comment I was prepared to make parallels in many ways what Dan had to say. When working with banks, there are multiple communities within banks, and they look at issues and they look at problems in very different ways. If you talk to an infrastructure IT person, a data scientist, they almost bring a set of standards that are separate and distinct from the needs of the business as a business. You go talk to the business people, and the data standards that the data scientists come up with really are not very meaningful. If you talk to a trader, the trader has to do pre-trade analysis. They want to make sure that they can do the best pre-trade analysis because their profitability depends on their ability to understand the trade they're about to enter into. And so I think that it's not just, as Alan Grody mentioned, you have to get the leadership in charge in support of these efforts. And that's always the case with any kind of transformation in the business. But you really have to be able to bridge the chasm that exists between business people and data and IT people, because at the end of the day, you need a standard that conforms to good data science practices, but you also need a standard that is clearly a value proposition for the business people. And if you can't do both, then you really are going to fail. There's no question about it.
Alan, thank you very much for sharing your point. And I forgot to invite you to introduce yourself at the beginning to that, Alan. And if you wouldn't mind, just pop yourself off mute again and just tell everybody a bit about your interest in this space and what you do. Thanks, Alan.
Sure. I mean, Willie and I are partners in the leadership of the Actis project. My background is academically as an economist, former professor, Brookings Institution Economic Policy Fellow, number of years working in government, wrapping up my government career as head of a financial regulatory agency. And it, quite frankly, was that experience in heading a financial regulatory agency that led me to the conclusion that, in fact, the regulators were not collecting the right data. It couldn't be analyzed. And I had concerns that no one in the business really had the data necessary to understand what was going on. And then the 2008 crisis hit, and it was clear no one, the CEOs, the Treasury Secretary, the Fed governors, no one had the data, the analytics to really understand the crisis as it unfolded. And the origins of the Actis project really go back to coming up with an alternative that in fact would address the major failings in data that were revealed to everyone so clearly in the crisis.
Alan, thank you very much indeed. Super stuff. Angus, would you like to respond to anything that Alan has said? If not, we'll go straight to Tanyel, but I'll invite you, Angus, if you wish to respond to what Alan has commented.
Let's move on to Tanyel.
Okay, Tanyel, thank you very much for being with us. It's great that you're here. Please do take the opportunity to introduce yourself and share your thoughts. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I assume it's good afternoon to many of you, and good evening and good morning and goodness knows. Thank you for speaking to us, Angus, and it's nice to finally meet a lot of you. I've sort of jumped onto some of these meetings rather late in the past. It's really fascinating to hear many of you talk. I'm on a few boards as an advocate and advisor. One of them is the Economics Working Group for the European Women's Lobby in Brussels, and I'm an international representative for WILPF on disarmament, trade and economic affairs, and the technological developers coordinator for the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, which is the trendy name for lethally autonomous weapon systems. So I sort of mix a little bit of trade, economics, finance and technology. And it was interesting, actually, Alan, you just mentioned something about, I wrote something next to me and I wrote sparsity of data is bias. And Willie, you said something that sort of, it made me happy in my heart, I suppose, about the universality of the language of maths. And I think just something I wanted to kind of plonk into the discussion and put to you, Angus, because I'm really curious to hear if these are if this is a focus in your working groups, and how others, because so many of you have so much experience in your sector, which eludes me. That of course, you know, maths is a universal language, but the application of it, as many of you know, when it comes to algorithms and more so machine learning and deep learning, that's not universal. There are value judgments, there's anchoring, there's selectivity, and some of that may be socialized, some of that is due to the absence of the availability of data, but some of it's due to the way that, many of you will know this and some will know vastly more than myself, the way that programs are trained and learn, and that heuristic approach, they can actually evolve. I called it once, I think in a talk, a highly efficient, well-processed mistake. So I'm curious in the sense that bias is both, can come from, and these aren't necessarily social judgments, but selections around what data is to be selected and analysed. Straight statistics can be quite simple, but when you interact that with, someone mentioned mortgages and loans, someone mentioned retail credit cards. We've had things in the news, I think, about Apple Card, even though they sort of made a rather opaque judgment around that. The opacity of algorithms in themselves. I just wonder what people's thoughts are, and I'm curious, Angus, if this is something that that you're discussing at the bank and in this process going forward. Is you can't entirely mitigate it, because it's the way machine learning works. So, you know, whether one kernel spits out another mistake, it's, you know, it selectively remembers and selectively forgets things that build a program. Some of those things that it forgets will be very, very useful, and some of those things it remembers and builds the next iteration of the computer program will be the problem. And I just wonder how you're approaching going forward with the exponential degree to which processing power is increasing. We haven't really got round the fact that bias is a fundamental problem. Unpredictability of the complexity of the systems are fundamental problems. And what discussions you have around, I don't know, challenging institutions to be wary of that, safeguarding, mitigating issues, so that we don't, by trying to mitigate one problem, reinstitutionalize a whole other set, I think is broadly my question. And it really kind of an open question, actually.
Well, Tanya, thank you so much. You've opened up a whole new kind of symposium of issues around the effectively the governance of data and the stewardship of data and the provenance of data, and basically making sure that we don't accidentally engineer into the system something that's going to, you know, bite us on the backside in years to come, big time. And it's possible. So thank you, Tanya, for raising this. Angus, some really interesting points there. Any comment around any of that? Have these sorts of governance issues and risk of, if you like, contaminated thinking and bias getting into the machine, so to speak, or literally, have you had conversations about that?
So, I mean, I think there was a number of aspects that were brought out in this question on machine learning itself, and the use of artificial intelligence and biases potentially in models. That's not my area of expertise, and I can't really comment on that. I'm a lowly person who's trying to get the data that other people can run models on. Exactly how those models work and the outcomes that they produce is a separate question. On whether we have an issue of, I guess, bias within our data collections and the way we think about collecting data, I think it's, I mean, again, it's not really something we looked at the review. You know, my personal opinion, I think, is it's an interesting point, and I guess it speaks to, you know, particularly from an analytical perspective, actually, there's always a tendency for you to do analysis on the data that you have. And anecdotally, I know that the Bank of England, for instance, I think has published more research papers on a mortgage data set than pretty much any other data set, and that's partly because we have more mortgage data than any other data set. And so, for instance, I know that commercial real estate is probably an area where we've done less analysis, probably historically, at least that we published. And so one would hope that one of the benefits of this sort of transforming data collection work hopefully could be and should be our ability to perhaps get our hands on a wider range of data in the future at lower cost. And therefore, we have less of this bias where, at the moment, because the cost of the collections are quite high, because it's hard to get the new data, because things are less flexible, from an analytical perspective, you're an analyst in the bank, you're likely to use data you've got rather than try and get new data. So maybe in the future, if our data collections are more flexible, then we can mitigate some of that bias.
Thank you, Angus. And I've got no idea whatsoever whether Taniel would be happy to or not, but I'm assuming, Angus, the sort of alternative perspective around things like data governance stewardship is a perspective you'd welcome in your committees and your discussions and your fora that you're creating. I'm making an assumption there, Angus?
Yeah, and it's important, and as I think we hope they are today, that our data collections continue to be safe, that we continue to comply with all the relevant legislation around data ethics and data privacy and data protection, etc. That can't be sacrificed when we do this work.
Thank you very much indeed, and wonderful, really good to hear it. Let's go to Willie. Please do share your point, then we'll go to Gavin, and then we're going to go to our next speaker, who is going to be Berku. Forgive me if I've mispronounced Berku's name. Then Bruno, then Willie, back to Willie, then Patrick. So Willie, to you first, then to Gavin. Thank you very much, Willie.
Okay, thank you. To you, Taniel, the question of math in this game here. The way we apply, and I will explain it a little bit more, I think at the end, or I don't know when I get my 5 minutes, but we applied to the financial contract. A financial contract is an exchange of cash flow, and that has always followed algorithmic rules, even though they were handwritten by lawyers. So this part you can really mathematize, and that's not an interpretation. That's the algorithm is the reality. And it's not the same like what in artificial intelligence. Actually, we say we should not apply artificial intelligence for a problem which you can solve at the root with clear instructions. That there is no. So the interpretation of a financial contract can be well expressed algorithmically. Yeah.
I'd like to quote you on that if I could.
I think there's a natural synergy actually with Willie and Taniel in terms of the way you think and the way that you see the world. I think you should fix up a conversation. If you want to do that, just Alexander, why don't you connect Taniel and Willie by email and they can chat. We're going to go to Gavin, then we're going to go to Alistair Milne. Okay, so Gavin, we're more or less on time. Gavin, if you can be quite succinct, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, it seems to me that the biggest difficulty is the banks knowing what actually their customers have actually done with the money that they've invested, particularly as bonds and that market, the banks didn't have to put any core capital because they were AAA rated for the government. Now, if they leverage down and then they buy more bonds and then they don't need to do that and they buy more and more and more, you can get the leverage going up. Now, leverage works just as powerfully on the way up as it does on the way down. And long-term capital management was leveraged 30 times. So with a small flick on long bonds from 0.5%, 1 to 1% or 1 to 2, that's a halving, if not more, of the value of the lenders or the borrowers in terms of the banks, and that needs to drive down. So the question would be, below the bank, what are they able to find out or demand what has actually happened to lending into that has gone into the bond market?
Thank you. Angus, is there anything you'd like to say to that, or can I move on to the next person that wants to say something? Angus, would you like to respond, please?
I think we can move on to the next one. I'm not sure if I've got a sensible response.
Okay, we'll pick up on that in due course. Thanks, Gavin. You, as always, make some very, very astute points. Let's go to Alistair Milne. I know that Alistair would like to say something. And I mentioned, Alistair, earlier when we were talking about the idea of a meta study of all the work going on around the world around the topic of data standards. If anybody would like to get involved in that little mini project, then please do let me know. I'll put a note in the chat shortly and you can respond to that if you wish to. Alistair, over to you. Thank you.
Andy, thanks very much. I'm very happy to maintain contact with everybody who's involved here, of course.
Yeah.
I don't, just a slight feeling of, I always prefer to under-promise and over-deliver. So you're building me up very well in terms of what we'd love to do. But I thought I should give a little hint of what I think the, independent commentary can add. And I think this relates very closely to what Angus has been saying. This has been a great discussion, but it's been perhaps a little bit too UK focused. So one of the points I'd bring to the table is that this thinking about data transformation, data standards, improving regulation, but actually integrating it into the way firms themselves operate, I think is getting a bit of global momentum. And this is something which I think is new compared to 3, 4, 5 years ago. So I'm going to put it in the chat. I'm going to put a link to the European Banking Authority. So they have a consultation which opened a couple of weeks ago on integrated regulatory reporting. And I haven't studied it in depth, so I don't know. I'd be interested in Angus's comments. I mean, he may not have had a chance to review it in huge detail. And of course, the UK is no longer part of the EU, so it's a parallel initiative. But another, it's not quite at the same level of practical action, but the BIS is taking an interest in this area, and there's a second link to what they call the FSI Insights, which is addressing this area. I guess the question I'd have might be particularly for Alan, but perhaps others with US links. When these discussions have been around for quite a while at a slightly lower level. So when the global LEI was launched back in 2012, and a number of people here were involved in those discussions, and that's been pretty successful, but it's just one element of the solutions we're looking for. Now, I think, as I said, there's a much bigger momentum at a international level, at more senior level. I'd be wondering from Alan whether there's any prospect of the Office of Financial Reporting getting kind of, which was under a bit of a political cloud under the previous administration, and whether there's a possibility of, which would seem to me as part of the US Treasury, that's a natural coordinating point in the US. I'd certainly be hopeful that this might get up the political agenda in the US. And just one final comment, which is sort of separate, but while Tanya was raising important points about bias, and I think I have two things where that chimes with me. Firstly, I think we may make a bit of a mistake if we overemphasize standards per se. The value of standards is that they help us get the data, which in turn delivers business or societal objectives more effectively. So we've always got to keep at the front of our minds what's the good outcomes we're seeking to achieve, and that's a concern. As we use more data and we use more automation, will that introduce biases? This is a separate point. I think what I would suggest, this comes a bit out of some research we've been conducting at Loughborough. One check, I wouldn't say it's the perfect solution, but one check is actually through data standards which support greater data sharing. So if my insurance company is giving bias in its insurance pricing against certain customers, and I think that happens. I noticed when I moved from a town to the country, I got a lower rate, but hang on, that's a bias. I haven't changed. I'm just as bad a driver as I was the year before I moved from the town to the country. So my rating, there's something wrong there. I shouldn't have got a cheaper rate. I'm actually driving more, but before the pandemic I was. But the point, but if we support data sharing, which can allow competition between different algorithms and the opportunity to put in monitored algorithms, which have been, as it were, checked for bias, data sharing is actually a route for putting in corrective governance on that type of bias. So, this is a big and complicated area with many issues that need to be brought together, but I think another point I picked up from Angus, which I would strongly support, is we're not going to do all this in one go. It's rather about a journey, understanding we're on a journey to much greater transparency through sharing of data, And sharing can mean many different things. You know, it's not necessarily putting everything in the public domain. And that data standards of and the work of the Bank of England data transformation plan are important elements on that journey.
Alistair, you've shared so much wisdom in your points there. That's been really interesting. I love the idea that data sharing is a route to help correct bias. I really do get that. We're going to go to Alan Mendelovitz, and then I'm going to go back to Angus for any final comments before he finally gets a break. He's been on his feet, so to speak, for much longer than we anticipated. It's gone so well, Angus. I hope you haven't minded me keeping you on the stage, so to speak, longer than we originally planned. Mr. Alan Mendelovitz, keep your point brief if you can, please, sir. Thank you.
Sure. Alistair, thank you for your comments. As I know you know, I'm the father of the Office of Financial Research and wrote the legislation for it, and it certainly has not been able to operate the way we intended. There hopefully is a possibility that things will improve with the new administration. I'm actually part of a committee that's working specifically on that issue. The other thing of interest that you might find is that surprisingly, the FDIC, the Financial Institutions Deposit Insurance Organization, which is a regulator of course, the U.S. banking system, along with several others in our bifurcated system. And the FDIC initiated a rapid prototyping project competition last summer to address the issue of data reporting. It was not an open competition in the sense that 45 firms were invited to compete, 44 large and small for-profit firms, and the not-for-profit Actis Financial Research Foundation. At the various breakpoints along in the competition, competitors were cut, and there are currently 11 firms still in the competition, and the Actis Foundation is one of the 11 surviving firms. So I was quite surprised, given the history of innovation when it came to data at the FDIC, that they took such a dramatic lead and have stepped out and are, I think, doing one of the most interesting things possible. My last comment really goes to the issue of data and data standards. Rich made a point of talking about the difficulty of communicating. In one sense, for what we're trying to address today, using the term data standard, in fact, is misleading, and I think is detrimental to progress in terms of understanding what we need to do. There's a long history in the financial world of talking about data and dealing with the diversity in which the same things are referred to by different names. And when they talk about data in this long history in finance, what they're talking about is the terms of financial contract, notional, interest payment, etc. And what really is needed is something, a transformation in the way of standardization for the financial sector and for better regulatory oversight of a standard that supports current and forward-looking analysis. Because that's really what regulators should be interested in. And that is really what the CEOs of financial institutions should be interested in. And the standard we need is not a data standard, but a financial contract standard that makes possible the kind of analysis that bank executives and regulators need to understand the condition of the businesses.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm aware that we have a couple of folks, Federica and Hamish, who want to make points, but to keep us on track for the moment, we're going to move ahead. I'd like to invite Angus, if he has any, to share some final words before we move on. Angus, is there anything you'd like to say in, if you like, wrapping up your piece as succinctly as you can, please? Thank you.
A couple of things. So just on Alistair and Alan, I think it's actually really exciting to see the amount of initiatives that are ongoing in the space globally. I think that perhaps one of the differences compared to previous years is we've had such pockets where they've done a lot of work in Austria and Italy as two examples in Europe. We've had other pockets in perhaps the data standard space where there's been success like LEI. The great thing, it seems to me now, is that it's quite a big swathe of the financial sector looking at this problem in a much more holistic strategic sense than we've had previously. Just to wrap up, for me, as I said at the start and throughout the presentation, we want this to be a collaborative process. We want people to get involved, to contribute. So do send either myself or Martin an email. Our emails are on the presentation, but if you can remember, it's angus.moyer@bankofengland.co.uk, and I'll put it in the chat. And also do read our transformation plan. It's on our website, and if you just Google transforming data collection, hopefully you can find it.
And if you missed the email address, the slides will be circulated tomorrow by Alexandra, so you'll be able to have the contact details there. Folks, I think we owe a real sense of gratitude to Angus for setting out what the Bank of England's doing, planning to do. I am really pleased that there seems to be a very genuine, inclusive, let's all go on this journey of dialogue together approach being articulated by the Bank of England through Angus. I think that's fantastic to hear. Can we please all show our appreciation to Angus? He's been speaking for much longer than we originally planned, and Angus, I'm very grateful to you for that, because it's been a very interesting conversation, your thoughts, but also the interaction we've had with other guests as well today. Thanks, Angus. Very, very good job. Let's all show our appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very much, Lou. Well done, well done. We're now going to go straight to Burku, who's going to spend up to 5 minutes. I need to manage the time quite tightly, so we're going to go up to 5 minutes to Burku. I can see you there. Thank you, Burku. Please do introduce yourself and spend a few moments, as succinctly as you can, sharing with us your thoughts. But of course, please do start off by telling everybody a bit about yourself, your organisation, and what you're all up to. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you very much, Andy. Good evening, everyone. My name is Burcu Menteşoğlu Tuncer from the Global LEI Foundation. I'll share a few slides for facilitating our discussion, and I will try to be brief as much as I can. So let me start introducing the GLIFE and Global LEI system. I see from previous comments that some of you are very much familiar with the LEI and the Global LEI system, but I will just give a very brief introduction about who we are. So we are a not-for-profit Swiss foundation founded by the Financial Stability Board in 2014. We are overseen by 71 regulators from 50 countries. And we have LEI, legal entity identifier issuing organizations, and it's 39 as of today, and it's increasing. Up to date, we have over 1.8 million LEIs due to different regulations, around 120 regulations from worldwide. Around 60% of these regulations are from Europe. So as I mentioned, we have a three-tier system. On top of us, we have the LEI Regulatory Oversight Committee, which represents public financial market authorities. From UK, we have Bank of England and Financial Conduct Authority. And then we are the Global LEI Foundation. We ensure the operational integrity of the Global LEI system. And then third, we have local operating units. These are the organizations who are issuing LEIs to legal entities. And for instance, in UK, we have London Stock Exchange. So what is an LEI? Actually, LEI is the Esperanto of legal entity identification for us. It's a 20-digit alphanumeric code based on the ISO 17442 standard, and it is composed of two information, I would say, two levels of information. Level 1 information is the high-quality basic business card information, and the level 2 information is the corporate structure, including direct and ultimate parent of the legal entity. And we are talking about Bank of England's data collection transformation projects. So I'd like to highlight 4 papers here published by the Bank of England in recent 2 years. Bank of England has a very progressive approach in terms of using data standards and legal entity identification. For example, in the Bank of England's new real-time gross settlement system and its migration to ISO 20022, the LEI is mandatory for financial institutions in payment messages. And the bank also considers to make it mandatory for all entities depending on the growth of the LEI globally. Also, in response to UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategies Corporate Transparency and Register Reform consultation paper, it's basically reforming the Companies House. The Bank of England suggested that the Companies House could generate LEIs as a unique global identifier for all businesses in the UK on a systemic basis as a primary identification number, or an ad hoc basis for entities who wish to have LEIs as a secondary identification number. And also, as I think Angus mentioned, Future of Finance report was very important, and open data for SME finance papers. And in both these papers, the bank suggested that the LEI can support cross-border identification and digitization for all entities, but particularly for SMEs. and the businesses could pool their data together under a single identity, and that is the LEI, and they can create a portable credit file to shop around for finance that they need. And this file could be shared more easily with banks and other credit providers, and allowing better access to a more diverse and competitive sources of finance. And because of LEI's global recognition, it can enable businesses, and particularly SMEs, to access finance for cross-border finance opportunities. And here I'd like to discuss a little bit about Bank of England's discussion paper, Transforming Data Collection, and why it is important for us, for the global LEI system in general. Angus mentioned the complexity and legacy in reporting systems, and there is a need for long-term reforms where the adoption of common data standards is considered as part of the solution. So the discussion paper also emphasizes that one of the main challenges in data collection is the reconciliation of regulators' need for efficient, timely, and good quality data, and reporting firms' ability to reuse the data they submit. So on one hand, data should be useful, granular, and easy to consume for regulators. And at the same time, it should allow reporting firms to either reuse the data in other reporting requirements, or to enhance firms' internal data management capabilities. So as already recognized by the Bank of England, indeed the LEI as a global open standard can breach these two needs. A research done by Lowehouse in collaboration with Glyph found out that financial institutions on average use 4 different identifiers to identify a legal entity client. Sometimes the onboarding time takes up to 6 to 7 weeks. So using multiple different identifiers leads to inconsistent information, problems in terms of liability of data, and drain on resources, since reconciliation of different identifiers always require manual intervention. And in return, there is lack of transparency due to reliance on proprietary identification systems. So the problem is that there is a lack of standardized approach to legal entity identification and verification. So since the regulatory reporting aims to assess large exposures to a single counterparty or a group of connected clients since the financial crisis that we're speaking of, it was very crucial and understandable for regulators to have a standardized and consistent identification. But what about the benefits for the legal entities, the registrants, the financial firms? So we're suggesting that reporting firms can employ the LEI as an umbrella identifier in their data models across their different business lines and systems. So systems can speak the LEI, the same language, without manual intervention. Incorporating the LEI consistently across their internal data management systems would enable better communication across business units and improve the client experience, and ensure that key reference data is always up to date. Therefore, we agree that additional costs arise where the information requested by regulators is not used for other purposes, if it is just one time only. However, in the case of the LEI, the financial institutions have multiple use cases and opportunities to leverage the LEI in their data management systems and processes. We are aware of also there are different initiatives undertaken in the UK. Of course, now we're speaking about the UK, that's why I'm talking about the UK, but of course in other countries as well. And there are different regulators in charge of it, for instance, FCA for open finance, Pay UK for new payments architecture, or Competition and Market Authority for open banking, and so on. So here it's important to have a consistent LEI requirement that can enable reporting firms to reuse their identity across borders or in other reporting regimes across and other initiatives in UK. Lastly, I'd like to talk about a little bit about on our recent initiative, Validation Agent Model, which allows financial institutions to generate LEIs for their clients as part of their Know Your Customer process and procedures. We enrolled this model last year, and it is basically based on the idea that the financial institutions, when they onboard a client, they have to check the legal name, verify authorized signatory, business registry information, headquarter, legal address, and corporate structure of an entity they onboard. So why not we leverage these business as usual KYC procedures or client identification procedures for generating the LEI in collaboration with LEI issuer organizations. So it will look like this flow chart in screen. The customer would apply to open a new account at a financial institution, and we are suggesting that financial institutions can leverage free and publicly accessible Glyph API to see if the customer has an LEI. And if it has an LEI, it's perfect. The financial institution can use and consume the LEI data internally for internal data management purposes, or even when they have digital onboarding solutions, they can pre-populate customer reference data. But if the customer of the client does not have an LEI yet, this is the point we think that the validation agent model can be leveraged by the financial institutions. So in collaboration with an LEI issuing organization, they can issue the LEI to their clients. So in return, they would be using the LEI not only for reporting or regulatory requirements or compliance purposes, but for internal data management and client identification purposes. So the advantages of adoption of the validation agent model would be multiple, reducing onboarding costs and 10 to 15%, according to a research done by McKinsey on Tier 1 banks, better data quality and transparency, reduction of the AML penalties or any transaction penalties, and efficient onboarding and better client experience, because the financial institutions would equip their clients with a lifelong global digital unique identity that can be leveraged in multiple occasions and use cases. So I'd like to stop here. I hope it's not too much LEI marketing, but I just wanted to highlight the use of the LEI in different areas other than our core area, the capital markets. So I'm open to any questions and comments from the audience.
Thank you very much indeed. That was a really good session, I'll put a note in the chat to my colleague, Alexandra. We need to have you back with a fuller speaking session, because there's so much that Global LEI is doing and is so relevant to what we're talking about. I can see that, excuse me, I can see that Alan Mendelowitz has raised his hand already. Oh, I need to keep us to time, folks. So if we can go with really short questions, comments, and really short responses as necessary. Alan, over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. That was a really great presentation. When you look at a financial institution, the LEI is issued for the individual corporate charter, and most financial institutions have hundreds, if not thousands, of different financial subsidiaries that make up the institution. The LEI is not issued for the integrated family that make up the real business. And so from an analytical perspective, from a regulatory perspective, from a counterparty perspective, what's important to us is not the individual counterparty charter, but the corporation integrated business that in fact is made up of multiple charters. How are you addressing this issue within the LEI effort?
Yeah. Thank you very much for the question, Alan. Indeed, as you mentioned, as Global LEI system or the Glyph, we do not have, I mean, validation agent model. Can you hear me now? I see some question, maybe. Okay. Validation agent model is one of the tools for improving or triggering voluntary adoption of the LEI for corporate hierarchy, as well as you mentioned. But so far as I know, there is one financial institution who really created all the Christmas tree for its all subsidiaries, which is Citi. And also Nestlé's corporate structure is also very developed, including over, if I'm not wrong, over 100 subsidiaries. But since at the Global LEI system, the child is reporting the parents, it is very much dependent on different subsidiaries to obtain the LEI and then report their parents' information. Of course, it can be also reverse reporting, parent to report all subsidiaries, but the general rule, the rule adopted by the ROC is from child to parent reporting. And I mean, besides the regulatory requirements and regulatory mandates, validation agent model is one of the very recent initiatives that we are really promoting for further adoption of the LEI voluntarily.
Thank you very much. Again, what a useful exchange of thoughts. I'm going to go to Federica. Federica, your hand is still up from before. I don't know if you wish to make a point at this stage. Yes, you do. Please do introduce yourself and share your point, Federica. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for this opportunity for sharing my experience, which I hope will be useful for understanding the difficulties that we all as a data analyst in finance face every day. Briefly, in a few minutes, I am an actuary. I'm Italian. I know Andy because we share some interests in pensions. I've spent some years in England. Basically, I have master in finance, specialization in finance, and spent years trying to understand.
Federica, forgive me. Allow me to interrupt you. The signal is breaking down very badly.
Okay.
I'm going to move on, and we'll try to come back to you later if we can. Okay,
sure.
We'll try to do that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we're going to go straight to Bruno. Bruno, please take the opportunity to introduce yourself. But whilst you're about to do that, let us all thank our last speaker for her session. It was very informative and a great set of slides. Thank you very much indeed, Baku. Thank you. And we'll have you back. So, Bruno, over to you, and we'll try and get back to Federica later on. Thank you.
First of all, so I am Bruno Tissot. I'm heading the statistics at the Bank for International Settlements, and I'm also the secretary of the Committee of Central Bank Statisticians. So I was in. Thank you for inviting me to make some comments. In a nutshell, I would like to say what is being done at the Bank of England. It looks great and looks very sensible compared to what other central banks also are doing. So this is a journey for many central banks, and I hope it will bring a lot of positive things. What can I bring to the table in just 5 minutes? I think I would like to highlight 3 points. One is that what is really important for public policy institutions is to move from the micro to the macro. So the key is to have effective data collection frameworks to support micro-macro data integration for policy use. Okay. The second point is that in this endeavor, the SDMX standard can help a lot, and I will elaborate on this. And the third point is that I think some people have already touched on this. One issue is data governance. So, first point, it's important to have effective micro data collection frameworks. Why is it important? We have multiple objectives when we collect micro data. First, there is micro data that is important from a system-wide perspective. Okay, global systemic banks. Second, we want to have more understanding of distribution issues. This was obvious after the COVID crisis. Third, we need to enhance better the micro data in our statistical production chain. So go from the micro to the macro using these granular bricks. Fourth, we need to have more, and this was said also, help to design and evaluate evidence-based policies, and macro data can help to do that. And last point is that we can also have new analytics because we can have micro level information. So think of what we just said before. If you look at very micro level information on firms, then you can recombine this information, for example, on a consolidated basis or on a residency basis. And at the BIS, we do the two types of exercise, and this is very useful. So central banks have a lot of experience, and it's interesting because central banks are users of data and are also producers of data. Okay, I'm just referring to some groups of central banks that are working. For example, INEXDA is a group of central banks working on these issues. So 3 points that are important with this experience. First, there's a lot of initiatives to have integrated reporting process, as was described for England. So what we call cubes. Second, there's a lot of important work on methodologies, so on dictionaries, for example, the BIRD of the ECB, or identifiers. We mentioned LEI, but the RIAD at the ECB is also very important. And basically, the idea is to collect once, use multiple times. And I would highlight three factors for success, and we have an IFC publication on that. One is collaboration between the stakeholders. Second is to have comprehensive data methodologies. And third is to have adequate platforms and standards. Of course, there are several standards, as was mentioned today. And I would now focus on one standard that is very important for this micro-macro integration, I think. And this is the SDMX standard. So in a nutshell, it's an ISO standard that has been there for 20 years and that can support the production, dissemination, exchange, or data sharing of statistics. And there is a lot of governance, good governance, and public trust in this standard. What is very important is that it's not a standard on data, it's a standard on metadata. So the role of metadata has been clearly emphasized, and it's very important for SDMX. We have also a lot of open source tools, so it's public. The standard is developed by the international organizations. We put a lot of money to have tools that are produced, that we finance, and that are available for free for the international community. And why I'm saying that this standard can be very important for this micro-macro integration is because we have the new version of the standard that we will launch this year, 3.0, and this standard that deals with macro statistics will now be able to deal with micro data, and in particular to deal with all the reporting data that we mentioned today that I would qualify as financial big data. This is big data from the financial industry. And of course, what is key is to have interoperability, as was mentioned before, for example, with XBRL, and to reconcile different types of data collection, so supervisory data collection, statistical data collection, etc. And looking forward, we will continue to work on this standard because I would highlight 4 priorities. One is to enhance data sharing and hence reduce reporting cost. Second is to make use of global identifiers. I will not repeat what was said for the LEI. Third, we think, and it was mentioned today also, that we need to move to the push, from the push to the pull mode at some point. And already we are doing this, at least on the macro statistics. And the last point is that we need to develop confidentiality preservation tools to facilitate this data sharing. I would like to finish with a few remarks on governance. I think governance is very important for public institutions working with data. On the macro side, it's relatively easy. We have principles of official statistics. I would like to remind that the principles, they want to have, they emphasize the role of high quality official statistics for policy decision. It emphasizes that public confidence is essential, and we need to have fundamental values to govern the statistical work. But the problem is that now we are tapping into a big alternative data. Okay, big data in the financial system can be financial big data, so this reporting of data that can come from firms, but also very new unstructured data, like using text data, for example, for subtech applications. Or, for example, to have online prices on, for example, in the mortgage industry. So we need to adhere to some professional and scientific standards also with these new types of data sets. And this is particularly important for public institutions like central banks that will act on this data. So because their reputation and their credibility is at stake. What can we do? This is just a personal view, but I presume that at least we could work on a kind of set of best practices. And there are already some examples of central banks using, for policy purposes, private data sources. And so we have some examples that we have documented in the reference that I will present at the end. But for example, this set of best practices could cover the fact that the data should be unbiased or produced transparently with adequate metadata. Also that the data provision should be independent from the business goals. Also that we could have benchmarking exercise. And at the end of the day, you need some kind of certification. So these are just ideas I wanted to put forward. And all this work, the references are in this slide from Basel. Thank you.
Bruno, that was fantastic. That really was. You've condensed so much highly valuable information into just a few minutes. And I look forward to being able to hear you speak at length in more detail at a future Transparency Task Force event, Bruno. That was excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Does anybody have anything they're itching to say, or are we okay to go on to our next speaker? Just wave at me if you want to say something. It looks like we're all okay, in which case we're going back to Willie. Please, Willie, share your thoughts. Maximum 5 minutes, please. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. You know, there has been mentioning of Actus several times, and Actus an algorithmic standard. And I think this term is puzzling for some people. And I want to talk about what it really means to make it more understanding. Some surely understand it already. And what are the benefits of an algorithmic standard? Okay. Okay. So first of all, why do we need a new standard? Or we should also ask, what is a standard used for? As it has been already mentioned by Alistair, you know, a standard cannot be independent of just anything, you know, there is a target. And of course, this standard is not only for regulatory use, but now here we talk in regular perspective. It has many more applications, but it's definitely used for regulators. And what do they need to do? They need to understand the health of the financial system and its risks. So a regulator needs actually the same analytic capabilities as a very skilled risk analyst at the top bank. I think there should be not less, actually more, in my opinion, because it's about systemic risk, about the big picture. So, but existing standards, take it FPML and accounting standards, widely used standards, they were not created to support the forward-looking analysis, which is the basis of any financial risk analysis. So you have to see the future cash flows, basically, and how they vary on different conditions. But current regulatory reports are static, are very much accounting-based, and the final number is often a nominal value, maybe a market value, that's it, but a static number. And as such, it's backward-looking. Accounting numbers are a collection of the past things to today, actually. Fair value is a different thing, market value, but still it's a static number if you have only that one. And today's regulatory reports are not timely. I think everybody would agree on that on most points. So we need a standard that supports forward-looking financial analysis, near real-time analysis, so timely analysis, which also gives us the ability to identify interconnectivity and systemic risk at the end of the day, so that we cannot regulate only single banks, but the risk as the system as a total. So now we talk about Actus, which is a standard that supports analytics. So let's go through the thoughts, what are behind Actus. First of all, financial analysis, I have mentioned it already, starts with promised payments or expected cash flow obligations contained in individual financial contracts. So each financial contract has obligations, as I mentioned before, they follow algorithms which can be described mathematically. So this is the starting point of any financial analysis, you know, the real financial part. And these exchanges of cash flows are actually exchanges of numbers. What is a cash flow? A cash flow is today only a number which goes from account A to account B. And these cash flows, sequences, these are patterns, they are limited. That's the interesting thing. There are not so many, even though it sounds as it would be, there would be many, many different financial contracts. The number, if you focus on that exchange of cash flow, is reduced strongly. And these patterns can be or are most precisely represented by algorithms. Actually, a financial contract by its nature is an algorithm. It's only hidden by the fact that the lawyers write it in many words and the algorithm gets buried in that. And what Actus does, it makes that algorithm explicit. That's all. And that's why it becomes then so valuable. So this is the insight of the basics of Actus, which is an algorithmic financial contract standard that supports analysis. Let me explain that a little bit more with with an example. Here we look at a real financial contract, the business, how it's in the business world. It's a lot of words. But somewhere it comes to this, you know, I pay you and you pay me back, and interest, and maybe a cap on the floor and whatever. So it explains basically the cash flow. What we really agreed to is something like that. On the left side, we have a bond, where in a simple bond, where the bond issuer gets some money, then pays interest, the green, and then pays the money back, the red here. The dashed ones are accruals or nominal value. On the right side, we see a mortgage, which follows the annuity pattern, AN in our language. These are PAM here, we'll come back to that, which is more complex. So the house owner gets some money. The first principal interests are only, they are capitalized, but then they start paying back, and there's rate reset. But what I want to say here, the true agreement are these exchanges. So, and if you look at these agreements, we see there are some algorithms. And if you go back to this, we wonder, what are these numbers? And these are the numbers which usually get standardized, like this notional, issue date, then maturity date, interest rate, and so on here. But these are parameters of the algorithms which generate these kind of cash flow patterns. And the question is, where is the algorithm? And the algorithm is hidden in these words, often not even, or most likely not even understood by the lawyer who writes it. But people who use it, they understand it. That's why it can be programmed here. And of course it is programmed in banks, but everything, every system programs its own way. And what Actus does, it unifies that representation, the algorithms, and in connection with the data. So, because what we really exchange is this, and what we need for analysis is this basis. If I go back, if I look at all the contracts, and if you go to this website here, you will find the taxonomy here of all the existing financial contracts which are there. Here we have, for example, the PAM, which we had before on the left side, and the AN on the right side. So behind the PAM here, we have discipline. So behind this notion is an algorithm which takes the initial data and turns it into cash flows. Or behind this notion, AN is an algorithm and initial data and turns it into cash flows. And here you have a list of all the financial events which happen to this contract under certain conditions. And the events are sensitive to the conditions. And what you're looking here, this is rock bottom of finance. So these are the numbers which you need everywhere, whether you do pre-deal calculation, whether you do accounting on this state, on say IFRS, local GAAP, if you do fair value calculation, if you do sensitivity, if you do risk, these are the base numbers. And with this, we build a system which can be analyzed by anybody who is allowed to look at the numbers. So what are the elements of the standard? So it's open source, it's free and open. And the elements are, first of all, we have a taxonomy of the contract types. That was what you saw before. Then we have a data dictionary, which defines the contract terms and identification of the contract terms used by contract types. So how the contract terms are related to the contract types. Then a technical specification of the algorithms, which in connection with these terms then generate the expected cash flows. And there's a reference implementation of the contract types in Java. There's a demo app on the Actus itself, and you can download it from GitHub. Yeah, that's it.
Wonderful. Very, very good. Very good indeed. Thank you, Woody, for squeezing all that in such a short period of time. We're going to go straight on to our final organized speaker, which is Patrick from Bayern. Of course, please do everybody share your contact details, links to web pages, etc. in the chat. I'm sure many of you are hearing some things for the first time, and it will have created some interest, and you can follow up later on. And what I'm going to do, we're going to formally finish the session at 8:15, but I'm going to leave the channel open for those of you, 8:15 UK time. I'm going to leave the channel open for anybody that wants to linger on afterwards and chat away in a lightly facilitated manner. Let's go to Patrick. Patrick, lovely that you're here. Very pleased that BIAN is represented today. Please do share your thoughts, Patrick. Thank you very much. And of course, start off with an introduction to yourself. Thank you.
Good evening, good morning. I don't know where you are in the globe, but first of all, thank you very much to allow me to share what BIAN is actually doing with regard to this data standardizations initiative. My name is Patrick Derde, and I'm the information architect of BIAN and also the custodian. BIAN is the Banking Industry Architecture Network, which is actually a non-for-profit organization that has the mission to lower the IT and operations costs. And the IT and operations costs are especially caused by the interoperability of a lot of information systems. So a lot of banks, financial institutions, they suffer actually the ambiguity of information that is exchanged between information and information service. And we wanted to solve that. In 2008, the organization started, and the organization is actually a collaboration of a lot of people who are together working on a standard. Of course, financial institutions are involved. You see here a number of them, and in a quick look, you see that they are located all over the world. But also a lot of suppliers of financial services, consultancy companies, software suppliers, they are all participating in developing this, this standardized content. Also, a part of the initiative is that what BIAN is doing is also aligned with other standards. And BIAN is actually nothing more, nothing less than a reference architecture, a toolbox, if you want, that allows you, the different financial institutions, to create their agile digital bank. And in that toolbox, we have lots of instruments. And I'm not going to talk about these instruments such as the service domain and example processes, but the important part here within this community is this data modeling part, because BIAN is also suffering this. A lot of banks are using a lot of terminology. We are thinking that we're understanding each other, and we don't understand each other. So we want to bring some. We want to bring some structure in it, and all the information can be found on the website. www.bian.org. So all the information that I'm going to, that BIAN has is freely available for everyone. But now let's have a look at this data initiative. BIAN is making a distinction between data and information. Data are simply the facts of the things. Information starts soon as you do something with data. You bring data into a context, or you manipulate data to make reports or to make analysis. That's information. BIAN is not going to talk about knowledge and wisdom. That's too subjective. But what BIAN is doing is that. By the way, I'm an actuarian, and in insurance, when you do something in insurance, they say, well, insurance has to do with uncertainty, which means actually that how can you work with uncertainty, that is define your things in certainties. And this is what BIAN is going to do. BIAN is going to develop business objects. Business objects are the things that simply exist in reality and have their characteristics. We are focusing on the metadata, the meaning of the data. And these objects, these are also related to each other in a standard way. So what BIAN tries to do is to come up with unambiguous definitions. I'm not saying that we come up with unambiguous terminology. We're coming up with unambiguous definitions so that we exactly know what we are talking about. And that is based on common data model structures. So it's not only a matter of terminology and definitions, it's also a matter of data model structures that will be shared between the financial community. And also, and we started this this year, that is, we are also thinking about, can we also define banking data types, such as when talking about a fee, what are the typical set of characteristics that you always have for a fee? Or when you're talking about a product, which is the typical standard product structure? And here, for example, we can refer to ISO, which are coming up with the banking products and services or services standard. So we refer to that. So this requires something. So our way of working is that we come up with a set of elemental business objects and how these are related to each other, accompanied by patterns, taking into account that we are IT and organization agnostic and that we use a strict methodology to follow. Because in financial world, a lot of terminology is going on. Stakeholders are using their own language. It's a speech community. And actually, there's a lot of confusion. A lot of confusion because we have a lot of standards. All these standards, they define their terms and definitions on their way. A lot of them are messaging standards, or reporting standards, or regulations. And actually, a lot of confusion exists. How are we going to solve that? Bjorn said, well, let's create a business object model. And this business object model is actually a solution for the problem statement. If the reality is for everybody the same, why do we model it differently? That is because of the fact that we are interested, we view it differently. And what is often done in speech communities is that we have actually view modeling. And what Bjorn tries to do is to come up with these underlying basic data, what contracts, for example, and we are using a pattern and a process. For example, we use the uncoupling of the terminology and the underlying concept. We use a classification mechanism of when we have concepts, which types of concepts do exist. When the type of concept is an object, then we are asking ourselves the question, what is the type of object? Because the objects are the things in reality that are related to each other, actually also in a kind of a mathematical or natural way. And then we say, okay, when we know what we are talking about, we can start thinking about how these things are related to each other. And that is continuously turning, and our members are using this way of working to come up with the financial industry data model with a common vocabulary, a common data model, common data types, and the separation of speech communities from the semantic communities. It's co-creation by all our Beyond members that you saw in the third and the fourth and the fifth slide. Everything is on the beyond.org website.
Wonderful.
Okay, that's actually what we are doing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Patrick. Again, very clear presentation. Your slides will be circulated, so everybody will be able to access those. Ladies and gentlemen, I personally am comfortable to say, without feeling awkward about it, I personally have found the speaking sessions today to be particularly good and particularly informative. Can we please take the opportunity to thank all of our speakers now? We had Angus, we had Berkut, we had Bruno, Willie, and just now Patrick. It's been a very, very interesting session, in my opinion. It's been excellent. We'll be organising the next Transparency Task Force Symposium on data standards in the next 3 or 4 months or so. We haven't got a date yet. Of course, we'll circulate that. We also need more members to become subscription members, because we don't run this on thin air. It does have cost, and we need to keep ourselves afloat. So we'll be telling you all about the option to become subscription members. What we're going to do now is keep the channel open. I'm going to go straight back to Federica and invite Federica to make the point she was trying to make earlier. If Federica is still with us, are you there, Federica? You may be. I think she may not be. We may have missed the opportunity to have a point made. In which case, I will very simply invite everybody to depart now if you wish to. Of course, it's the end of the session. We will keep things going. We'll keep the recording going because we'll record right until the very, very end. But we're going to keep the channel open until 1/2 the hour in roughly 12 minutes time. If anybody would like to take the opportunity to say something now, please do so. Or of course, you're very welcome to jump off the session if you'd like to. Entirely down to you. I hope you found it useful. Very, very good indeed. Would anybody like to share a thought, a point before we move on? I think it looks like we're all pretty good. Jim, I think you moved your hand then. Your body language suggested, Jim Martin, that you might want to say something. I may have misread that, Jim. Please take the opportunity, if you wish, Jim, to introduce yourself and share whatever's front of your mind right now. Thanks, Jim.
Actually, I just want to say thanks to the entire group. The presentations were actually very intriguing to me and enlightening for what I'm doing. My company is doing digital currency, actually. We have a contract with the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. And as we get set to go live tomorrow, actually, we are now facing the next questions of how to take our pilot system and start integrating it into the rest of the world's banking systems. And so this was one of our first steps into better understanding what it is we need to do in order to make this work with the rest of the world.
Very good. Very, very pleased that you're here with us, Jim. Thank you very much indeed. Super stuff. I think we're all done. Let's wrap it up there. Thank you all very much. It's been good to have your input, participation, great speakers. We haven't got the date for the next one sorted out, but it will be in roughly 3 or 4 months' time. My objective is very simple. It's to unite the world around the idea that we can all do a lot more stuff better together, and we may as well talk about it to see how we can find out how to go about doing that. Thanks, folks, very much.